It depends on what your metric of a successful Trump presidency
Sure.
looks like at the end of 4 years. Does it look like an economy that has returned to sort of pre-pandemic, if not numbers, vibes?
Donald Trump has launched a full frontal assault on each of these areas, and that requires him to burn an awful lot of political capital, which is why he's seeing a certain degree of short-term political backlash.
Welcome to Political Perspectives. I'm Sarah Bedford, in for Hugo Gurdon. And if you're watching this on one of the Washington Examiner's social media channels, please like and subscribe. This week is the first anniversary of President Trump's inauguration. So we've had a lot of reflections here at the Examiner across Washington about how that first year has gone for Donald Trump's second presidency. What's your grade, Jim Mantle?
It's incomplete. So obviously I think President Trump has had very big success in terms of controlling the border. We're in progress towards some of the interior immigration enforcement against which he's getting a lot more pushback domestically and politically. Have to see also whether the business community, which still remains an important part of the Republican Party's fundraising base, will tolerate some of these enforcement measures. We have all of these protests against these enforcement measures. But I think on that front, he's been very successful. We've had some of the early steps against the bureaucracy, against DEI in the federal bureaucracy specifically, but also just regaining control, the elected president being in control of the permanent sort of Democrat-run bureaucracy in Washington. I think he's taken some pretty big first steps there. But the economy was a significant part of why he won the election, and voters are still giving him low marks there. Inflation is a very difficult thing to resolve because the price increases are baked in to a certain extent, and it's about a lower rate of inflation, a lower rate of price increases going forward. So I think that's really where he's going to have to show some progress to the voters if Republicans are going to have any chance in the midterm elections.
Right. I suppose it depends on what your metric of a successful Trump presidency looks like at the end of 4 years. Does it look like an economy that has returned to sort of pre-pandemic, if not numbers, vibes that you can afford your life? Is it a real mass removal of illegal immigrants? Or is there some other metric of success, like you mentioned, the federal government sort of having become this unaccountable, sprawling bureaucracy over the course of many years, and Donald Trump sort of reasserting that Article 2 power that he has?
Right.
Is that what success? I mean, we're talking about what immediate, I guess, short-term political success looks like, and also what a Donald Trump legacy would look like.
100%.
And so how much of what he's doing right now is contributing to short-term political successes? It sounds like you were hinting there's not that many, but are we seeing him sort of set up for a longer-term legacy right now?
Well, that's also just the interesting aspect of having a president serving non-consecutive terms, right? Because what might look like success for a president who's going to run for re-election is not necessarily the same for a president who's looking for their place in history. Now, that it will be the same for his party. The Republican Party and J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio are certainly hoping that he's going to leave Republicans and themselves set up for 2028 success. But yes, I mean, I think a big part of what Trump is trying to do is that there are certain institutions in American life, the media, academia, and most importantly and directly under his control, the federal bureaucracy, the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government. These are things where Democrats have entrenched institutional advantages, asymmetric advantages that endure no matter who is in the White House. And they've never really been very directly challenged by a Republican president before. Ronald Reagan a little bit, Richard Nixon in his second term a little bit. Donald Trump has launched a full frontal assault on each of these areas, and that requires him to burn an awful lot of political capital, which is why he's seeing a certain degree of short-term political backlash. But if he's successful, that's, number one, a part of his long-term legacy, and number two, I suspect it'll be a model that future Republican presidents will follow.
One thing that surprised me about Donald Trump's first year in office is the extent to which it's been focused on foreign policy, which was nowhere to be found on his campaign platform. It's not something that he ran on. In fact, he ran very much on not getting the U.S. entangled in foreign conflicts and really focusing attention back home, America first, as they say.
Sure.
And so has that been a sort of surprising element to you, and do you expect that to perhaps make his base grow a little skeptical of him?
Well, I mean, some of these are things that maybe aren't as big of a departure for him as some of his supporters would like to think. I mean, he certainly has talked more about being like William McKinley than he's ever talked about being like Robert Taft. And so some people, I think, project to a certain degree their own foreign policy views on President Trump. But yes, I think he's intervened militarily more than he did in the first term. He has spoken about military interventions in ways that maybe would commit him to doing more, although he hasn't really done more yet, that will get some backlash from within his base. But obviously he's looking towards, again, his legacy, which, he really views it as very important that the United States has more power within the Western Hemisphere, shuts out its adversaries like Russia and China within this hemisphere. Really big part of his legacy. He views it as a big part of American national security. And especially if Republicans don't do well in the midterm elections, this is just going to be an area where, as president, he has a very free hand, and he'll have less of a free hand in domestic policy. So it might not have been what certain swing voters who moved toward Trump and away from the Democrats were looking for in 2024, but it is consistent with some of the things that Trump has wanted to do, and it is very much consistent with a man looking at his place in history.
Potentially saddling Marco Rubio with the brunt, if this is the least popular, aspect of Donald Trump's record in 4 years, that could unfairly disadvantage Rubio over Vance, who wasn't even pictured in the Situation Room, the makeshift Situation Room when they went and got Maduro. Vance would have more plausible deniability about all of that, right? That Rubio just wouldn't.
Well, that's going to be the big question. If that competition ends up being something that really takes place, is that Vance does to some degree have some plausible deniability. The Trump foreign policy doesn't really seem like a Vance foreign policy, although there are people in Vance's orbit who would dispute that he's not been an active part of advising the president in these things. But there will be people who are critical of Vance because he has not been able to stop things like Venezuela. And he, in fact, cast the tie-breaking vote against the War Powers Resolution in the Senate on Venezuela. Now, no modern vice president would have voted against the president.
His hands are kind of tied there.
Hands are absolutely tied. But it does give him a level of ownership with that, whereas a lot of this is seen as sort of a Marco Rubio type of project. But yes, both of them are going to have some problems if this foreign policy is not seen as successful. Rubio won't really have a very compelling argument as to why it should be him over Vance, again, in the event that they do run against each other. But both of them will be saddled with the Trump legacy or benefit from the Trump legacy, depending on how that's all perceived in 2028.
Yeah, a lot of gambles were taken in the foreign policy sphere so far. One of them is this new fixation Donald Trump seems to have on Greenland. And I shouldn't say new, because this is something that Donald Trump has expressed interest in before.
Let's date back to the first term.
Yes, but I would have called that maybe a mild interest. He was Greenland curious, and now he's sort of Greenland obsessed.
Yes.
What do you make of Donald Trump's new fixation on Greenland and, crucially, the sort of threats against European allies and the newfound aggression with which he's going after Greenland?
Well, I think some of this does reflect his overall diplomatic approach, and this has been an area in which he's had some success. I mean, I think being willing to play hardball, even with your own allies, is a big reason why all the members of NATO are much more keeping their commitments to defense spending-wise to the alliance. That was something that when they were more politely asked by Joe Biden and Barack Obama to pay more on their defense budgets, it worked better when Trump played hardball with them. Trump's also had some success in trade talks that way. Trump has also had some success at least getting Ukraine to cosmetically agree to certain things in the Russia-Ukraine peace deals that the Ukrainian government had previously not really been willing to go along with. But it hasn't so far worked very well with Greenland. And it doesn't seem that the public is very understanding of why he's so interested in Greenland. I think there are some legitimate national security interests there, and it fits in with his broader hemispheric project. But I think that text message with the Nobel Peace Prize, it fits in too much with people's negative perceptions that he's not America first, he's Trump first, he's very me, me, me. You know, he wants the recognition, and it seems small to people. So the polling on this is very bad for the president, with one major caveat. It's not very clear to me that the voters care as much about this as Trump does. So even though only maybe 9% of people really say we need to go and grab Greenland, or we need to go and buy Greenland, probably only about that percentage cares very deeply about the issue either. So even if Trump's position is unpopular, not sure it's going to move the midterms very much, other than to the extent that it feeds into the perception that he's not focused enough on the economy.
So he's potentially banking on the fact that even if he goes really hard trying to get Greenland, people simply won't care because they don't really check in on the day-to-day health of Western alliances, and they don't necessarily know that Denmark, it kind of owns it, but not really, and there's all these natural resources. I mean, there's a lot I didn't know about Greenland until we all started talking about it, that, you know, there are some pretty compelling arguments for taking over Greenland, even though a lot of Trump's base and swing voters would say, like, why are we buying this piece of ice, as Trump called it at Davos, when I can't afford to buy a house, you know?
Yeah, I think that image-wise, it's bad, and I also think the way he has gone about it, there are all kinds of ways for the U.S. to take a bigger stake in Greenland without buying it, without militarily taking it over, although Trump has now said that he doesn't really want to do that. Having these tariffs as a way of trying to force Europe's hand on all of this. I think the risk for Trump is that these things seem so far removed from the bread and butter economic concerns that are probably going to be really what swings the midterm elections, and certainly what swings 2028. But Trump thinks it's very important, and it's also clearly gotten personal in a way that it wasn't really personal in the first term. And so, when the president really sets his mind to something, he wants to see it done.
Speaking of ICE.
Yes.
The Immigrations and Customs Enforcement crackdown in Minneapolis has really been polarizing.
Right.
It's sort of you look at it, if you are a conservative and you see protests out of control, you see local elected Democrats encouraging what can start to look a little bit like insurrection at times. And, you know, if you are on the other side of that coin, you see a regime that is out of control, you know, brutalizing communities. And so how do you think Trump has navigated this so far? And what could he do, what should he do to sort of tame the tensions in Minneapolis?
Well, I think, first of all, it looks very much like a replay of the George Floyd protests of 5 years ago, which Trump was in office
I would
at that time.
actually, I think it's different. I think it's worse, but we will circle back. You go first.
Well, I think it's worse in the sense that I think it is recommitting Democrats to the position of questioning the legitimacy of any kind of immigration enforcement, particularly any kind of interior immigration enforcement, saying that kind of enforcement is racist. Now, they were more broadly saying law enforcement was racist in 2020, but only really a radical fringe of Democrats ever fully embraced that, whereas this does appear to be becoming, once again, a mainstream Democratic position. There's also a level of violence being engaged in or provocations toward violence being engaged in by semi-normies in a way that maybe wasn't true in the Floyd protests, at least in Minnesota 5 years ago. But I think a similarity, and you do have all the same politicians who are involved in this, are taking the lead on this. I think a big similarity is that in the beginning, there's a lot of sympathy for the liberal position, the progressive position among uncommitted voters. And I think you're seeing that right now in the polling on ICE and the optics and the imagery of ICE with the masks and so forth is disturbing to some people who aren't really very committed on the immigration issue. But over time with George Floyd, the public started to swing back and started to disapprove much more of the rioters and of the social and civil unrest. And I suspect, and certainly I think the White House suspects, that over time that movement is going to happen here too.
When you look at the 2020 George Floyd riots versus now, I think one of the key differences is that to the extent that there was looting and a lot of violence, much of what we saw were crimes of opportunity from people who took advantage of really spirited protests to commit crimes that police weren't realistically going to be able to stop, particularly when police were the focus of those protests.
Right.
But what you have in the ICE situation is you have elected Democrats sort of openly encouraging, if not offering thinly veiled encouragement, activists to attack federal law enforcement officers who are legally carrying out the enforcement of laws that Congress passed.
Right.
And so there's this sort of key difference where, this looks worse than a lot of what we've seen that's come before this. And I actually don't know that Republicans have taken it seriously enough, that you have Democrats who are encouraging what are essentially militias to go out and attack federal law enforcement because they don't like the laws being enforced. That's different than, just looking the other way when the windows of a Nike store get smashed in. And so, Donald Trump has threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to go after Minneapolis. Do you think then that Donald Trump risks escalating it even further with that?
Well, he certainly seems willing to take things further. So it was really just social media posts disapproving of the riots during Floyd back then from Trump. Now he's at least clearly exploring more seriously other legal options. Yeah, obviously there's a risk that all of this is just going to be a sort of mutually reinforcing race to the bottom, right? So you have, unlike in 2020, these are not local law enforcement people, and defunding the police doesn't have any immediate consequences to local elected Democratic officials. This is a federal body committed to enforcing laws that these Democrats don't really think are legitimate in the first place. So they really don't have any incentive to call off the dogs, as it were. They don't have any incentive for people to not protest them as vociferously as possible, even get into fights with them. So the more people protest against ICE and follow ICE agents around and try to dox ICE agents, try to get into fights with ICE officers, confront them, dare them to stand in the way of their moving cars, the more they do that, the harsher ICE's tactics and the federal government's tactics will become, which in turn will mean that the protesters will feel more justified in what they are doing. And the only thing that will really stop it is either something really terrible happening or the general public just deciding that they firmly side one way or the other.
Well, Jim, hopefully it doesn't end up a race to the bottom. Thank you so much to magazine editor Jim Antle for being here today. Again, I'm Sarah Bedford in for Hugo. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the Washington Examiner's channels.